good afternoon, or probably rather good evening or good night to all of you. I don't even want to know at what ungodly hour I have forced you to congregate down under. But that's where we are. I will try to be as brief as possible in my introductory points so that we have a bit more time for a fruitful exchange. I would like to essentially talk about 3 points which I believe are defining the position of Europe in the world right now. And it is critical to understand these points because we are at a turning point, at an inflection point in global affairs. We have probably taken the last 30 years and the trends and developments of the last 30 years, in essence, globalization through westernization, too much for granted. A lot of us, and I also include the European institutions here, were maybe a little bit too much on autopilot and thought that we would, cruise control our way to a better, more integrated, rules-based multilateral system. But at the very latest, February 24, 2022, with the full-scale onslaught of Russia on Ukraine, has brought a fundamental break in that global trend. So when the German government speaks about a Zeitenwende, a turn in the course of events to describe what happened more than 2 years ago, I would even go a step further and speak about a fundamental break in those historical trends that we believed we were managing for the 3 decades after 1989, 1991. So I will start, and that is my first point, to give you a brief state of play of where we are in our support to Ukraine and in our reaction to Russia's war of aggression. Secondly, I want to go beyond that because, and that is a point that I would really like to impress on you, because Russia's war of aggression is not just a regional conflict. It is essentially about how we want to organize international relations, how we want to, in a way, live together on this planet, and therefore managing it beyond Russia and Ukraine with third parties is going to be absolutely critical for ours and our allies' success in the years to come. And thirdly, I want to speak about the elephant in the room, or maybe more appropriately, the panda bear in the room, which is also very relevant to you, namely China, which is in a way maybe even a more defining factor of today's international system than Russia's war of aggression. So where are we on Russia-Ukraine? The interesting thing is that, and maybe because a lot of people did not want to believe that Putin would go as far as he did, Putin's aggression has boosted European foreign and security policy in a way that was inconceivable for many people just weeks before February 24th. If somebody had told me that we would be where we are today on Ukraine's accession track, on sanctions, on weapons delivery, on financing Ukraine, etc., I would have called medical attention for that person. So, to put it slightly cynically, Putin has boosted a development of the external dimension of the global role of the European Union as such to a degree that was inconceivable for many of our member states in the run-up to that aggression. We are today at nearly 100 billion euros of support from the European Union to Ukraine in different guises, military support, but also economic support. And that's absolutely critical because let's be crystal clear, we are, and I deliberately say we, in a war of attrition, in which Russia's strategy is clearly to wear out the financial and political patience, not just of Ukraine, but also of its supporters, mainly in Europe, the United States, and the rest of the West. So, extending this financial lifeline at times of economic difficulty in the European Union and in a period in which we find ourselves in dire budgetary straits ourselves was absolutely critical. And therefore, the recent decision in the US Congress, money wise, is also more than a financial lifeline. It is also, I hope, a psychological boost to Ukraine. That aid will continue. And I stress this because we are in a tricky institutional transition year ourselves. With European Parliament elections in a couple of weeks, a changeover in the leadership of the EU institutions in the second half of the year, etc., etc. So, strengthening that financial bridge funding way beyond 24-25 was absolutely critical. Secondly, the accession track. We have, for about 3 decades after the breakdown of the Soviet Union, pretended that our neighborhood policy was not a zero-sum game and that our hood, if you want, was big enough for many players. Whereas Putin, from the very outset, wanted to impose a bipolar model on us and on our little neighbors in between. Either you're with him or you're with us. Ironically, February the 24th, 22, has brought this to a head, and EU leaders decided already in mid 22 to extend the so-called European perspective to not only Ukraine, but also Moldova and Georgia. And why is that so important? Because that means that's the fundamental green light that these countries can ultimately, in the future, become members of the European Union, full members, that is. And that is a status, that is, if you will, a privilege that we and our leaders had denied these countries for decades. We've always said enlargement, that's for the Western Balkans countries and Turkey being a special case, but for no one else beyond that. And that has changed. So the succession perspective is more than a label, it's more than a nice little sticker we put on unsuspecting countries in our neighborhood, but it is a geopolitical investment. We are ready to extend the membership in the European family to Ukraine. And that's not just an end in itself, because the process of accession, for which Ukraine, I have to say, is surprisingly well prepared, given the situation it finds itself today, is in itself a stabilizing factor, economically, financially, politically, but also administratively, because it drives a fundamental socioeconomic, I would even say societal transformation. So in a way, we have responded to this geopolitical push that the war has created. A third point on the economic side. There's a lot of negative vibes out there about the international sanctions against Russia, etc. But when somebody, or if somebody had told me 2 years ago that by now we would have banned approximately 2/3 of our exports and imports with Russia, I would also have called medical attention. We have imposed the mothers of all sanctions on Russia. Russia is today an unsustainable war economy that is basically a giant on clay feet, and every day is becoming more dependent on China than before. We have cut off major revenue streams for Putin. We have denied him access to technology that he needs on the battlefield. All of this is very complicated, but the sanctions work, and the sanctions are a critical part of our efforts to help Ukraine win this war. And last but certainly not least in our policy of support towards Ukraine, we are very, very actively helping it procure the weapons it needs on the battlefield, not just through bilateral mechanisms with our member states, but also through the European Union. Now, I hope the irony is not lost on you that the European Union, this self styled great peace project, this sort of um, Kantian end state of at least regional peace, has become a major weapons buyer and weapons producer on behalf of Ukraine. Again, something that was unthinkable even a couple of years ago, when the European Union institutions would mutually sue each other in court over the question of whether our development aid would actually, be able to buy weapons for police officers in various African countries. So, in other words, we have come a long way. And this is difficult because the financial peace dividend that a lot of European countries cashed in after the end of the Cold War has literally eaten itself deep into the fabric of our, if you will, military industrial complexes. Weapons production, especially of those weapons needed on the battlefield in Ukraine right now, is a demand driven thing. I hope that none of you have a tank or something similar in your garages. I certainly don't. And what we had to do, therefore, is more than putting the cash on the table, but to actually ramp up the industrial production in member states that had become idle over the last years, to a point where the European Union itself is now producing and funding more than 2 million artillery shells in the key categories by the end of next year, and more importantly, is actually strengthening the industrial supply chains also internationally that we need to do that. And we have concluded so-called critical raw material partnerships with a number of partners worldwide, precisely to make sure that these defense industrial supply lines function properly. So, in short, to conclude on this first point, our support to Ukraine is unprecedented and it will remain strong. It is unwavering for the very simple reason that we are in this together. This is not a regional conflict based upon some arcane historical grievance, as some people in Moscow want to make us believe, but this is essentially about our own security. The idea that we could go back to a status quo ante, the idea that we could somehow just, fast spool back. I'm old, I still have video cassettes to the period just before the Russian invasion and freeze the moment there to move on towards a better, more stable, more predictable relationship with Russia, or should I say Putin's Russia, is frankly ludicrous. As understandable it may be from a human point of view, it will not happen. As a trained lawyer, I am still a believer, though not a practitioner necessarily of international law. So I know very well that we are not formally in a state of war with Russia as the European Union, but politically speaking, we are clearly in this, and we need to understand that we're not supporting Ukraine out of charity, but in our own hard-nosed interest. Because, as I said, the fact that Putin has thrown the kitchen sink at Ukraine also means that he is fundamentally putting into question how the international system is supposed to function. And that brings me to my second main point. Um, this is not a global conflict, but it is a conflict with global repercussions. And in order to be successful, we and our allies, the United States, but also our allies across the Indo Pacific region, need to understand that we need to strengthen the narrative that we use internationally, diplomatically, to explain what we're doing. In other words, assuming that the logic that we follow in supporting Ukraine across all the various strands of action that I just sketched briefly, and that this position, that these positions, that this logic, that this narrative would be shared across the globe is frankly wrong and short-sighted. We have been very successful together, notably with our American allies, to shore up support for Ukraine in a number of international fora, condemning Russia very actively, stopping Russian attempts to sort of freeze the issue in multilateral bodies. But these diplomatic successes cannot hide the fact that Russia is very skillfully playing its cards with a number of major, what I call global and regional swing states. I'm not just talking about China, I'll come to that in a second, but I'm talking about the Indias, the Egypts, the Indonesias, the Brazils of this world. Now, again, let's be careful not to create self-fulfilling prophecies here. This is precisely what some people in the Kremlin would like to do, to create a sort of West against the rest situation. That is not what we are heading to. We are not in a bipolar trap, but we are certainly in a situation where we need to be tougher and firmer in pointing out to a variety of third countries that they have a fundamental interest in working against Russia's aggression. Now, this is difficult because the war in Ukraine resonates very differently in various parts of the world. Apart from it being very far away, and you know what I'm talking about, and it also brings up different historical connotations. For some of them, this is just one of those many crazy European regional conflicts. For others, this is a Western conspiracy against Russia. For some others, oh, this is all about, ethnic minorities. Others see a raw material aspect there. Some of them see it as a quote unquote inevitable reaction of Russia against the West. So when you speak to leaders of various third countries, you get a whole plethora of partly, frankly, bizarre interpretations of the war. And all of that should make us think even harder on how we can build the long-term multilateral support for Ukraine. Again, I don't believe that there is something like a coherent front engineered by Russia against us. The BRICS themselves, to just use just one of those categories and fancy labels, have too many internal divisions and incoherent and partly even contradictory positions to be a clear-cut group that would be able to leverage its combined weight on the global stage. But, and that's an important but, they are united by this lingering feeling that Russia has a bit of a point, right? Although it may have chosen the wrong mechanisms to utter these grievances, but there is an underlying trend of thought that this is the end of a system in which the West wrote the rules and then said that they were inevitably global. And there we need to be very careful. What does that mean for us? We need to grow up as Europeans. We need to think truly globally. And in particular, we need to be more transactional. We need to stop thinking that our appeal to global principles is per se going to lead to their respect, their implementation, their enforcement. On the trade side, on the human rights side, on the climate side, on the side of global supply chain, energy security, what have you. And that means that we just have to look more sophisticatedly at what unites and divides us with individual countries. Now, you may immediately respond, look, that's the bread and butter of daily diplomatic work, right? That is absolutely true. But philosophically, this is a leap forward to for the European Union, which thought too much that, as I said before, we were surfing on a big historical wave that would basically lead in itself to a more rules-based global order. So what we have done over the last 2 years is precisely to have a much more transactional conversation with the likes of Egypt, India, um, Indonesia, other partners globally, in the G20 and beyond, to respond more actively to their specific concerns, to more intelligently leverage all different parts of the European toolbox, from financial aid to aid with migration to trade relations, in order to avoid that we fall into this bipolar trap. Again, this is not easy. This requires continuous work. And I also have to say this, the fact that we currently have a second major area of conflict globally in the Middle East doesn't help. The argument of incoherence, of even double standards, is something that is thrown at us very often since October the 7th. So, again, we need to cross read, whether we like it or not, these two theaters more intelligently. And that brings me to my third point. Some people have very smartly said Russia is the weather, but China is the climate. Um, and that is probably true in the sense that Russia, atrocious and heinous as its actions and crimes in Ukraine may be, is ultimately fighting, if you look at the longer term trends, a rearguard battle. Putin is fighting a battle of domestic survival. He is by now deeply invested in this criminal war. He cannot afford to lose it, but he is not at the crest of a historical wave in his favor. Let's be clear about this, despite all the skillfully played diplomatic shenanigans of the last 2 years on the Russian side. China is the name of the game. And although I don't want to fall into the famous Thucydides trap here, I think that we are all well advised to understand what a fundamental conundrum Beijing poses for all of us. This is frankly something that we in the European Union have woken up to too late. Although, of course, there are major differences in the nearly philosophical approach of some of our member states to China. Similar to what I said about Russia before, the idea that you could stabilize your relationship to a major international actor simply by investment, trade, Wandel durch Handel, change through trade, as the Germans call it, has frankly not worked. And we have to accept today that in this famous triangle that the European Union sketched for its relations with China, China being a negotiating partner in some areas, a competitor in others, and a strategic rival in third areas, that within this triangle, we have pretty clearly moved into the corner of the strategic rival. Does that mean that we can fully decouple from China? Does that mean that we can turn our backs? Absolutely not. But we can, as our president, Mrs. von der Leyen, has repeatedly put it, and we have to de risk. We have to map our vulnerabilities more intelligently. We cannot pretend that trade and investment in both directions, by the way, are in principle good. And we have to look at the risks that this creates for us. To be very frank with you, I find it astonishing that major German industrial players can smack bang invest or do a greenfield investment of more than 10 billion euros, so 11 something billion US dollars, somewhere in China, and pretend that this is a purely commercial decision. Um, in the opposite direction, we cannot simply pretend that every single incoming Chinese investment, even if it comes from a perfectly legitimate private actor, is politically innocent. So, in other words, also here, the European Union has to grow up and smell the coffee. And also here, we have installed a couple of tools that, frankly, were unthinkable a couple of years ago. We now have a European Union wide foreign direct investment screening mechanism in the context of which incoming FDI, and this is country neutral, country agnostic, so it's not just about the literal panda bear in the room, is screened, has to be screened by member states and is double checked by the European Commission services. And you wouldn't believe how big the interest of some, let's say, Eastern investors is in the literal little software garage startup somewhere in Denmark or the German Black Forest. So again, there's a very deliberate strategy that we see behind this. Conversely, we're now also looking, as I said before, at outgoing investment, at outbound investment. This is very difficult economically and legally, but again, we cannot find ourselves in a situation where, for instance, the facial recognition software employed in Chinese airports, train stations, border crossings, etc., is largely based on code written in Estonia and Denmark. That to accept that proposition would be blatantly and probably morally naive. We have to look at research funding, and again, the same underlying pattern here. Some universities are more equal than others, if I may say that, in an academic setting. We have to look at our own public procurement. We have to look at the security of our own critical infrastructures on the energy side, on the telecoms side. We have to look at the way certain competitive advantages are gained by certain actors. The European Parliament is in its last session before the elections about to vote on what we call a Forced Labor Act, through which we will in the future ban the import of products into the European Union based on forced labor. Now, easier said than done. This requires very careful and skillful analysis, but you get the drift. We cannot be in a situation where such massive distortion, distortions not just of competition rules, but of our most fundamental values of life and death in a way, lead to trade inconsistencies. And last but certainly not least, we have also woken up to the fact that we have new allies a bit further away beyond our immediate neighborhood who we have maybe not had sufficiently on the radar screen in the past. I'm particularly talking about the Indo-Pacific region, where we're trying to do what I said before, look at the interest of each sub-region of each country individually, and try to craft the most intelligent packages for each relationship on the commercial side, the trade side, the investment side, but also the climate, energy side, etc., in terms of regional security, etc., etc. So we're talking about a truly global Europe that, through the war of aggression of Russia, has, ironically, in a way, been forced to grow up in the space of only 2 years. And this geopolitical or geoeconomic Europe, if you will, is here to stay, also beyond the European elections. I would like to stress that. A very wise Austrian politician once said that election periods, campaign periods, are times of focused ignorance, end of quote. I think he had a point there. In the coming weeks or so, you will hear a lot of that focused ignorance in European quarters when the political mainstream is desperately trying to catch up with the populist right and the populist left in terms of crazy ideas, many of which will go against the grain of what I just said. So, in other words, we do not only have to reckon with Russia proper and its various tactics, the panda bear behind it, on which Russia is increasingly dependent, and various swing states globally. We also have to look at our own home front. We should not believe that what I sketched, a global Europe that has woken up to its global responsibilities, that is ready to play a major role on the global stage, that understands its global responsibility and also the costs associated with it, that all of this is wholeheartedly and enthusiastically embraced by the European electorate. And that would be, several Christmas wish lists taken together on my part. This is unfortunately not the case. We have to see and we have to accept that the popular base, the electoral base and platform for everything I said in the last half hour or so is, I wouldn't say fragile, but not something that we can take for granted. And therefore, it will require continued investment, continued political leadership by our political masters to continue on the path that I set out precisely. And I want to close with that, in our very own interest. The idea that Europe could return to what some people call an ostrich policy, putting your head into the sand, and pretending that things will just blow by um, without you pushing back. Those days are over. Again, globalization is not something that happens on autopilot. If we want a rule-based, multilateral, stable system, then we have to invest in it, and that comes associated with certain costs that we have to face. Thank you very much for your interest. I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to your questions.